Mike Mposhi, Minister for Environment and Economy from Zambia, distinguished global experts, ladies and gentlemen, I am privileged to welcome you to this event on measuring the green wealth of nations, the natural capital and economic productivity in Africa. Yesterday, under the co-chairmanship of His Excellency President Nguesso, the President of the Republic of Congo, and His Excellency President William Ruto, the heads of states and governments of African countries convened a presidential meeting on measuring the green wealth of Africa. We were indeed privileged to listen to the bold statements of their excellencies, heads of states and governments, all their respective passionately share their insights and visions on the green wealth of Africa. Their excellencies unanimously advocated for the proper valuation of Africa's green wealth and the integration of the values of its services in the systems of national accounts, or what we call SNAs. They recognize the need to build strategic partnerships and better coordination among African stakeholders for investments in valuing strategic natural assets that African countries have in abundance, including forest sinks, biodiversity conservation, soil fertility, and other ecosystem services by nature's infrastructure. Welcome, Honorable Minister from Congo. The communique adopted yesterday by the Excellencies was a clear testimony of the common position of African leaders on issues related to proper valuation of Africa's natural capital and incorporation in their GDPs. Just 1 week ago, in preparation for the World Leaders Summit here at the COP, that was yesterday's event, and today's meeting, the African Development Bank Group convened a high-level virtual ministerial meeting with all relevant ministers of economy and finance, ministers of environment and climate change, ministers of foreign affairs, as well as heads of national statistic offices. The participants also unanimously called for the urgency to prioritize updating of Africa's systems of national accounts and revaluing countries' economic sizes by measuring the green wealth or at the regional and global levels. Honorable ministers, distinguished global experts, ladies and gentlemen. Today, we will present key findings on the report produced by the African Development Bank on measuring the green wealth of nations, natural capital, and economic productivity in Africa. This policy paper was prepared following African leaders' Nairobi Declaration on climate change and call to action on the need to value the gross domestic product of Africa and ecosystem services, including its vast forests that sequester carbon to unlock new sources of wealth in Africa. I think we can conclude that this is a demand-driven process because it's been called for by the countries themselves. The policy paper that will be presented also responds to the recommendation from the 37th Ordinary Session of the African Union in February this year, which further emphasized the need to go green, to green the GDP by incorporating the value of natural capital and associated ecosystem services. Without preempting what my colleague and my namesake, the Chief Economist and Vice President, will say during his presentation, please allow me to give you a glimpse of what I consider are the key main takeaways at a personal level from this report. First, we need to invest in our systems of national accounts if we want to have accurate measure of our wealth. We need to support our national statistics offices and build capacity of our national statistics officers. Just look at two facts. Out of 38, only 38 out of 54 African countries are currently using the 2008 system of national accounts, which is the most updated system used globally. At the same time, only 13 countries, or rather 13 countries are still working with the outdated 1993 system of national accounts. Other countries still use an even older and abandoned system based on 1968 system of national accounts. I'm sure if I did a roll count here, you'll probably find there are many people who are not born in 1968. This means that the current estimate of our gross domestic product in many African countries are at best conservative and in most cases are not up to date and most likely underestimated. Next year, the United Nations will most likely adopt an updated system of national accounts, which could start being rolled out across the globe in 2026, 2027. This suggests that if we, African countries, do not update very quickly our system of national accounts, even at least to the 2008, we will continue misreporting on our wealth. But the reality is we cannot afford to stay behind other countries. This is not just an economic or statistic question. It is also a question of national pride and national sovereignty. You cannot live in a house and not know neither the inventory of your belongings nor their value. Because if you are robbed, how can you tell the police officers writing the robbery case what items were taken away from you or even their values? You cannot unless you keep regular inventory of your assets. The second bit, takeaway from yesterday's session, is that several African countries do not meet their 5-year periodically recommended in the 2008 system of national accounts to update GDP to reflect dynamic changes in the structure of the economies. What this does, it leads to an underestimation of the actual value of the GDP numbers, which is a sectoral misrepresentation and low international which leads to sectoral misrepresentation and low international credibility due to concerns about the overall quality and reliability of a country's statistical system. The bank did a survey in all 54 African countries on the status of implementation of system of national accounts, and the results are telling. Just rebasing the GDP to increase the GDP could increase the GDP by as high as 38.2% in Cote d'Ivoire, 36.7% in Benin, and 33.5% in Niger. Just that is the impact of this exercise. The second takeaway is that despite political commitments and ambitious initiatives by international organizations, multilateral development banks, and national governments, the implementation of national accounting has so far been piecemeal in Africa. Only 16 African countries out of 42 countries surveyed in 2023 were implementing at various stages the system of environmental economic accounting, or what you call SEEA, a system of national accounting that incorporates the contribution of natural capital and ecosystem services. Compare this to what happens elsewhere. The share of countries implementing natural capital accounting is 93% in Europe and North America, 60% in Western Asia, and 57% in Central, Eastern, Southern and Southeastern Asia. We need to talk the talk and walk the talk. It is time to turn our commitments and pledges into concrete actions. And distinguished experts, ladies and gentlemen, honorable ministers, I can reassure you that the bank is committed to support its regional member countries, okay, in their efforts to update their system of national accounts and to regularly rebase their GDP. Africa has a lot to gain from proper valuation of its green wealth and the integration of the values of its services in systems of national accounts. We need to act swiftly and make bold decisions to accelerate the measurement of Africa's green wealth. Let us work collectively to make this happen. Thank you very much.
Honorable Ministers, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed my pleasure to present to you this report on measuring the green wealth of nations, looking at natural capital and economic productivity in Africa. As already mentioned by the moderator and my namesake, the Vice President responsible for power, energy, climate change, and green growth in the African Development Bank Group, this report has been developed as a demand-driven report from the highest levels of the African continent, led by President Sassou Nguesso, President William Ruto, and other heads of states, and President Akinwumi Adesina, through the call they made during the Africa Climate Summit for this work to be done, that we need to take into account the green wealth of African countries in Africa's GDP. And that call swung us into action. And this presentation, therefore, will be focusing on 4 key aspects. Where is the? Okay. Those 4 key aspects will be: how do we revalue the green wealth of nations? And we are particular, not saying just Africa, because this is something that needs to be done globally, because when done globally, it helps to achieve 3 main things. First, a more accurate measurement of the wealth of nations, taking into account green assets, and also the flow of ecosystem services from those green assets, and also the carbon sequestration that comes from doing that. And we all know, speaking at the COP, that we're all interested in reducing the carbon flux associated with development. And forests, green assets that we have, is doing that naturally. I will call it nature-based solution to actually sequestering carbon from the atmosphere. And as you will see, the value of those sequestered carbon by Africa's forests, the second largest lung in the world, which is in the Congo Basin, is huge. Win-win for climate transitions, for green transitions, but also for creating jobs and driving GDP growth in the world and in Africa. Then the second thing then is looking at the point that my namesake, VP Kariuki, has already mentioned in terms of how are we measuring our natural capital at this moment. The status of natural capital accounting in Africa and around the world. How can we improve it so that we'll have a better, accurate measure of the flow of capital from our natural assets? And what is the status of the systems of national accounts across the continent, so that we know where we are and what needs to be done in terms of concrete actions to upgrade them to be able to take into account the ecosystem services that are natural assets, what I call nature's infrastructure, delivers to the world. Then we discussed briefly the key findings of the report and key actionable agendas. First, why do we need to revalue the green wealth of nations? I've already mentioned the 3 major points that it will help us address. And this derives from the fact that GDP, as we know, gross domestic product, is only a measure of all the goods and services produced in a country within a given time. And because it is about produced capital, assets that you have, your forests, your gold, your minerals were not mined and produced or sold in the markets does not count in your GDP. And then that means that countries are sitting on wealth of assets that doesn't also count in their credit worthiness or even their credit ratings. And we do know if you want to go and borrow from a bank, you can use your house, which is a stock, as a collateral for making it liquid in terms of using it to then get finance to do your development. So that needs to change so that Africa's natural assets can count for Africa's GDP growth and GDP and development. Second point, the flow of ecosystem services from nature's assets, both in carbon sequestration, water regulation, air quality regulation, and all those things that nature's infrastructure delivers for us, is the source of life and source of wealth for the world. So it's a public good that is being delivered to the world free of charge. But if I produce a carbon sequestration technology, I'll take it to market and it will be paid for. So we are discussing the carbon markets here, carbon trading and other things. So this question for us then is to how do we make sure that we can monetize that public good that our natural assets are delivering. Then natural capital accounting will then become a positive incentive for green transitions for the world. Because if your natural assets counts for your GDP, both as stock and as flow, there's no need for command and control policies on climate change. Because you will naturally take care of it because it counts for your bottom line. It's in your balance sheet. So that's how we conceive this study. And the status of natural capital accounting and systems of national accounts in Africa leaves a lot to be desired. When you look at that graph on the right-hand side there, you find that 2 of African countries are still using very outdated national system of account for 1968. That means that not all the items, including stocks and flow of assets that Africa owns, is being counted. We're still living at 1968. Some of the countries, 13 of them, are still using the 1993 SNA system, and only 38 are using the most updated system. Yet, by 2025, we're expecting a newer system that takes into account the linkages between the environment and the economy, including natural capital. So we really need to take action in order to upgrade our national systems of accounts to be able to take into account all our assets. When you look at Africa's implementation of natural capital accounting in itself, Africa is also lagging its peers. 25 or 26 African countries doesn't have any implementation of the current systems of environmental accounts that's already been implemented by their peers. 8 countries are still at stage 1 of that process. 3 countries are at stage 2 of that process. Only 5 countries are at stage 3 of that process. If you compare that to the rest of the world, in Europe, North America, and others, you'll find that countries are already at 93% in terms of implementing this SEA. That means that when you compare a current GDP that is quoted for an African country and a current GDP for their peers, you are comparing oranges and apples, because it's not all that is contained in the other GDP that we have in our own GDP. And that has significant implications for debt sustainability, assessments. It has implications for access to capital. It has implications for cost of capital. But when you look at Africa, our natural assets are immense. In our AEO 2024, we had already indicated that Africa's natural capital is worth about 6.3 trillion, not billion, trillion US dollars as at 2018. And if you look at that, it's distributed across all regions of the continent. So if this asset class is valorized and we are able to include the flow of produced capital by beneficiation and other actions into our GDP is certainly going to grow higher, to be higher than what we have now. So when we go forward, we see that this work is building on already excellent work that's been done by the United Nations Environment Programme. My colleague Pushpan Kumar is joining us virtually, and we'll talk about this during the panel session. When you look at the inclusive wealth of countries, Africa has significant asset classes, again, that we are not yet measuring. I'm not going to dwell so much into it because Pushpan is here to talk about it. But our natural, in terms of inclusive wealth measures, if we re-index by inclusive wealth, is in trillions of dollars, not billions as well. Now, you look at other issues that we need to look at here is then the disparities that we have in the current carbon markets. A lot of market failures where if you look at that line below that graph, that is the voluntary carbon market where carbon is priced at around $5 a ton. But if you look at the European trading system, it is about $70 a ton. So there's a huge gap between the price of carbon in Africa and the price of carbon elsewhere. And the implications, I'll leave you to draw your conclusions. Now, this is the reason why for us, monetizing the value of net carbon flux is very, very important for growing GDP in Africa, but also for driving green transitions, as I have already explained. So when you look at that, just using the aspects of carbon sequestration by forests alone, on that graph on the left-hand side, when you get the PowerPoint, you are going to see significant jump in the re-indexed green GDP of countries if we take into account only carbon sequestration by forests. And remember, these natural assets perform other public goods, air quality, water sequestration, pollination, and several other services that it delivers, which, if not monetized, doesn't count for us. So Africa is nature-rich, but cash-poor, if I quote President Akinwumi Adesina. And he says consistently that this shouldn't be the case. This study is a way of trying to valorize that natural capital so that we can be nature-rich or green-rich and cash-rich, again, quoting President Akinwumi Adesina. If you look at the slide on the right side, you will see what I call the injustice in the carbon markets currently. If we tried to monetize Africa's carbon assets in terms of carbon sequestration by forests, it will be worth about 5.5 billion US dollars if we use the voluntary carbon markets that's operational in Africa today. But if we use the European ETS system, it will jump to about 77 billion US dollars. The same asset sells so differently just because of the differentials in the market. And honorable ministers, distinguished guests, that tells us the value of appropriate pricing for carbon and actually quickly developing our own carbon markets to ensure that we can trade at par with other regions. And as the President Adesina also mentioned yesterday at the high-level session, it means that African countries that are currently engaging in all these swap mechanisms, you are actually selling your assets so cheap. So we need to consider that as well as we go forward. So how then do we monetize these carbon sequestration functions of countries and, well, forests only? And what does that mean for GDP? On the left-hand side, you'll find that the GDP of countries, if re-indexed only by carbon sequestration by forests, you are going to see huge jumps in many African countries. But we are looking at net sequestration here, net carbon flux. So for countries that are actually consuming instead of sequestering, their GDP is likely to decline slightly. But on average, for Africa, the African GDP as at 2024 would jump by about 66.2 billion US dollars, which is more than the combined GDP of 42 African countries as we speak. Again, this is for carbon sequestration by forests alone. Imagine what that would mean if we actually valorize all the ecosystem services that our forests and natural assets is delivering to the world today, not for tomorrow. If you look at Central African Republic, the GDP of that country at 2002 would have increased from the currently measured 2.5 billion to about 10.6 billion. You can imagine what that will mean for Central African Republic with regard to the headroom for borrowing and the cost of capital is huge. And that is why African countries need to take this very seriously. And I'm very happy that through the leadership of President Sassou Nguesso, President Ruto, President Adesina, and all the other heads of states gathered yesterday and who have been advocating for this in Africa, we have the political will to do it. It's now for us, technical experts, to come up with methodologies and help our national systems of accounts to address that loophole that has always made Africa's GDP look small among its peers. I was in a mission in Uganda, and one of the ministers asked me, do you really believe that 40% of Ugandans are living on less than $1 a day? I leave you to answer that question. It is because of these imperfections in how we measure our GDP that our GDP is always looked at as very low. So carbon sequestered adjusted GDP across countries, we have just listed some of the most forest-rich countries there, changes significantly. I won't go into details because of time. Then, what's the actionable agenda? We need to quickly institutionalize natural capital accounting in Africa. It's actually where, again, quoting President Adesina, the trillions of US dollars that is needed to finance Africa's green transition would come. We need policy integration. So this is not a role of the environment minister. It is the role also of the finance minister, national development, economy, central banks, because this is actually where the fiscal space of the country, of the continent of Africa would be unlocked. So we need policy integration to make that happen. But a lot of these forests are also transboundary. So cuts across countries. So regional integration and support by regional leaders is crucial for us to be able to unlock this particular asset class that we're talking about. But we also need to expand the natural capital accounting community of practice, which, working with the World Bank and all the other agencies, is already being developed. And I'm happy to say that the African Development Bank will be hosting the Africa Natural Capital Accounting community of practice going forward to ensure that we're able to make this happen. Capacity building will be necessary because most of our national offices of statistics still need both institutional capacity in terms of technologies and equipment, but also need human capital, human capacity in terms of upgrading their knowledge to be able to address all these loopholes that we have. And my namesake, VP Kariuki, has already stated clearly the position of the African Development Bank in supporting and continuing to help to build capacity in this area. We're already doing that. We will continue to do that. Methodology development is very important, but also adoption of that methodology in the global national systems of accounts is also very important. Finance, finance, and finance. As in everything, we will need money to be able to make this happen in countries, especially countries that have lower fiscal space today. So I would like to call on partners to actually please rally around Africa to help to move this forward, but national governments also to prioritize this in their own national budgets. So this meeting we're having today at COP29 is a follow-up to the meeting we had last year at COP28 presenting the concept of this work. And I want to thank several partners, the World Bank, the OECD, the IISD, UNEP, several universities around the world that has come together in order to produce this report. Let's work together to make this happen as we go forward. Updating the national systems of account in Africa is good for Africa, is good for the world, is good for green transition. And my final words will be to quote the wise man, Einstein, that lived before us. In the middle of all the challenges and difficulties we have in climate change, reaching agreements, negotiations, and so on, and also the challenges we have in our countries, in Africa, lies the opportunity for innovation. This work, being led by our presidents, is one of such innovation that could actually be changing the narratives and changing the way things are done forward. We cannot use an old map to explore the new world. That again is from Einstein. We need to change our mindsets about Africa, about Africa's natural assets. Africa's natural capital must not be a treasure trove for the world. Dig it out, send it far somewhere else, beneficiate it, and bring it back to Africa. That's not the model that will be good for the continent. It's not the model that will be good for green transition. So it is not good for climate. So the final word I will say here is that Africa cannot be natural resource rich and cash poor. Again, quoting another wise man, President Akinwumi Adesina. Africa's re-indexed GDP is good for everyone. Development partners, climate negotiators, the world at large. Let us come together to internalize the positive and negative externalities of development action on climate in terms of CO2 emissions by taking it into account in our own balance sheets in countries everywhere, starting from Africa. Thank you very much.
I will start by also just congratulating the team that worked on this report. It's really a very, very good report. When you read the content from this report, you can see it's a kind of alarm and a wake-up call for African countries just to reflect a bit on how natural resources, natural capital can really make African country rich. Yes, I totally agree with the statement made by President Adesina that Africa cannot be nature rich and cash poor. That's true. So, which means that a reflection a bit on the report. First of all, it highlights, the limitation we have while relying on the GDP, which is just an economic measure, just for economic performance for a given period. But when it comes to the natural assets that are there just to support this economy, so you can see that a big part is really missing. So a proper valuation of natural capital is really very important. And considering all those market failure and the externalities and what we'll be losing by also, through the carbon market by not having the really estimate, from the whole, the total wealth. I think this is really the right time, the right moment just to think on that. From some countries that have been implementing the natural capital accounting, including Rwanda, we can say that though we still have a long way to go, and we thank the African Development Bank that committed also just to provide this kind of support, just to upgrade the work on natural capital accounting for African countries that initiated that. So we think, and from the basic information that we collected under this natural capital accounting program, we found that we can make a difference. We can make a difference by capturing element of the economy that was not captured before. So which means that it's a kind of, I think it's even the way to go. If we need to comply with the 2025 system of national account, then definitely the system of environmental economic accounting should be adopted. So I really think that all African countries can understand the really need of having this proper valuation of the natural capital. Since we have this, we are a rich continent, and we need really to take opportunity of this fortune that has not been well, used. So I think I congratulate. I think the report makes, the report says a lot. So it's up to us just to take what's inside the report. Thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Owera. It's alarming, you said, that proper evaluation doesn't exist as it should, and it's a reflective moment, but this is the right time to begin to do that. Thank you for those reflective moments. We're going to come into the nitty-gritty of what can be done later on, but I just want to get Dr. Morsi's take overall before we get into the substance of what we need to do moving forward. What's your overall view, Dr. Hanan Morsi? Can we pass on? Oh, there you go. No.
Thank you.
Hold on to your mic.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I think the issue that we are currently discussing is a vital, aspect of what we need to do. I think the idea of capturing the wealth and the assets in terms of when we are tapping, for example, capital market or when we're borrowing is very important. But I think also I would say we need to take it a step further than that, because we need to see how do we, once we're able to capture the wealth itself, how can we monetize that wealth to address the issue that we are, resource but cash poor. So I think it gives us a very good foundation of an understanding of where we are, the wealth that we have, but I think it takes a lot more work to convert that wealth into income stream, because at the end, part of what you're assessed on when you're borrowing is basically your capacity to repay. So unless you're able to monetize these assets, it will be difficult. So this is also part of the things that we've been working, including with the African Development Bank on, for example, on issues of developing, carbon credit markets. This is one aspect, able to, monetize what assets are able to give. And we need to look into a variety of issues. Okay, what else can we do in addition to, the carbon credit markets? How can we build value chains in Africa and regional value chains based on the green minerals, for example, that we have? How can we, amplify all this wealth to get the maximum returns that we can from it? So I think this is a really important starting point, but I would say we have a lot more work to do to turn that potential into realities. I'd like to quote President Adesina: we don't need potential. So we need to make sure that this potential is turned into opportunity that we can actually seize for our citizens.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hanan Morsi. We do not eat potential, and certainly potential doesn't put money in the bank, and you've emphasized the need to enhance our borrowing capacity through proper evaluation. I'm going to come to Dr. Simpasa, and then we'll go into the more specific questions. Can we pass on the microphone to him, please? There are actually two microphones. The question I have for you is this. It's actually going to be a specific question for you. Within the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area, the collective work that's being done by the bank, the World Bank, UNEP, UNECA, and many other partners, how do we ensure that Africa adopts a model so that each country is not expending unnecessary resources and we're not really reinventing the wheel? What is it that we can do to accelerate the process and adopt a common framework moving forward? Your thoughts in that regard?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and thanks to the presentation that was made. while I go on to the interventions by the minister.
But I want you to stay on this question that I just asked you. Nothing else. I'm going to come to more specifics later on. Please address the issue that I just mentioned just now, if you don't mind.
Yes, I'm coming to that.
No,
because of the
no, don't come to that later on. I want you to go to it directly because we're short on time. Please, let's be specific.
The presentation talked about the regional integration and regional support policies, and that's very key. And you know that along the Zambia, DRC are developing a regionally based value chain for the critical minerals in copper and cobalt and other minerals that the countries share. That is the most important aspect we can draw from this kind of interventions, that we need to develop a common framework that will drive the development of the critical minerals or any other natural resources, the transfrontier resources that were talked about in the presentation, in order for us to generate resources and revenues, monetization that we talked about, that will allow us to leapfrog the development across the regional corridors.
Okay, I thank you for that. So I'm assuming that we start first with a regional framework and also an inter-regional engagement to ensure that we're all moving in the same direction. Would that be correct?
That's correct.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to come to Professor Pushman. My question to you is, as noted by Professor Rama, this work builds on the inclusive wealth of nations, which you have been leading in UNEP. How critical is this for Africa's green transition? How critical?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Okay, good. So Kevin has very eloquently discussed this in his remark. And one thing which is clear, and that conforms to our own report from UNEP, where we estimated inclusive wealth for 42 countries of Africa, that two trends. One is that the rate of growth of GDP is higher than the rate of growth of inclusive wealth. And the natural capital per capita shows a declining trend. So that is one part. A second is that somehow we are mixing income with wealth. And that is a bad economics, because then you have no sense of sustainability, because you are eating your stock and creating flow, and you are thinking that you are doing good, but you are not doing good. And that is not coming from us. That is coming from legendary economist Kevin would know more than anybody else, Arrow, Das Gupta, Scott Barrett, and many others. So in science, it is clear that the way we are estimating GDP and relying our decision on GDP is not going to help us in the long run. So I think the trend from this report as well conforms to the other trend. Second, why we need to put our effort on estimating green wealth or inclusive wealth for Africa. Kevin has mentioned that in many countries, people are still using the SNA of 1968, System of National Accounts of 1968, the framework. And that is not helpful. And Secretary General always says that we can't be writing the draft of our grandchildren progress based upon the policy and protocol of our grandfather. So if we are thinking about future, we have to think fresh. And in that context, not over-relying is good. And very practical example, when we all die, we don't pass income to our next generation. We pass wealth, including green wealth. So it is very important we understand where is the baseline and how we are doing. So that is the theory part. The practical part, and especially for African nations, we are talking, and I'm sure in Baku there will be a lot of talk, how we restructure our debt. can we think of having debt for nature or debt for climate swap? How we use sovereign wealth fund. And sovereign wealth fund does not come just by talking. We will have to show that how much is the wealth of the nation. And some panelists rightly mentioned that calculating wealth and natural capital also tells you about the solvency of the nation. So in order to implement the transfer of the fund from sovereign wealth to the conservation and the progress, we need to know the natural capital.
All right.
Then we have one more thing which I would like to mention here, that a lot of talk on nature-based solution and carbon damage adjusted GDP is being talked. How do you do that? You can only do that once you have carbon adjusted natural capital of the nations. And from practical point of view, from climate lens, it is very important that we know natural capital of the nation. And that's why I'm not mincing my word in complimenting, congratulating African Development Bank in taking a lead and really demonstrate that, hey, a beginning can be made, which they have done.
Thank you very much, Professor Pushpan. Very, very well stated there. We note that natural capital per capita is decreasing, and we're using outdated systems for national accounts that are actually 50 years old and counting. The need for debt to nature swaps, and again, carbon damage adjusted GDP. And my assumption, just from hearing what you just said, there are countries to the global north that would actually take a hit from that rather than the global south. Would that assumption be right?
Yeah, just one more remark here, very briefly. I think
very briefly.
Last 2 days we were in London in the group of chief economists, and Kevin, we missed you there. I mean, people were missing you. And all the chief economists from FCDO, from OECD, from World Bank, IMF, NORAD, so on and so forth, everybody was in agreement that in order to have a sound policy formulation, we must know the wealth of the nation and natural capital of the nation. So even from the hard-boiled financial economists, there is an appetite that, yes, we need an estimate of natural capital. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Pushpan. I'm going to come to Professor Collin here. Again, you've heard all that has been said. Kevin talked earlier about the need for capacity building. From your experience, what is it that we need to do as a continent to accelerate the process, an area that you actually have tremendous experience in? Kindly share your thoughts with us on this. Again, practical and easily implementable. Well, there's nothing that's easy, but things that we can do to fast-track capacity building in this regard, because we're a continent in a hurry.
You are, but the challenge here is the challenges are immense, and it's not an easy thing to do what we are talking about here, to rebase the GDP and include very intricate ecosystem services into your national accounts. So I think that you really should take this opportunity. We have a lot of experience to build on.
Can we go to a full screen shot of Professor Collin, please?
There is a lot to be done. So what I would really recommend that the AFDB and all partners do now is to take this opportunity to really invest in the human capital of the continent. Of course, we need to do senior civil service training to implement this, but we can do so much more, and we should do so much more. We really need to also, give the opportunity for senior management to have executive master's programs. We need to have dedicated 2-year master's programs in multiple countries to build the capacity to also do the policy analysis that the Vice President was talking about. But we also need to even build deeper like that, with these PhD specializations and maybe even postdoc programs to develop the methodology that was mentioned in the presentation. So I think now is the time to be ambitious. If we are to take this on as the first continent in the world to really mainstream natural capital accounting into the system of national accounts, let's do it right and let's do it seriously and invest in academic programs and senior civil service training to make it happen. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Cullen. One of my sayings is that for whatever endeavor we're involved in, if you're not in the business of communication, you're not in business. So what efforts are being made? You talked about mainstreaming. What kind of information is going out there and on what platforms to ensure that at a granular level and on a national level, there is an urgency of now to do what it is that you're talking about?
So we are building on really giants here. It has already been mentioned, the Inclusive Wealth report by UNEP, but there is also the Changing Wealth of Nations reports by the World Bank. Those are at a quite high level, although they start to present data also for countries. But what we really need to do now is to take this down to the country level and do also the policy analysis for that. So I think that, I mean, with all the case study countries that have been part in this Wealth Accounting Valuation of Excess and Services program by the World Bank and other initiatives, we have seen and we also documented in the report on the kinds of policy conclusions that can be made, that can be drawn from these kinds of exercises. So that can be done continuously, and I would really recommend the African Development Bank to build that kind of coordination capacity at the bank and have annual reports, etc., to really feed this into the policy making of the countries, just like you do with the African Economic Outlook now, but with the focus on natural resources. So what we need now is really the resources to implement the actionable agenda that has been outlined in the report.
Thank you very much, Professor Cullen. Again, very much appreciated. I'm going to come to Dr. Simpasa here. I'd like you to talk about the implications that you see for Africa's GDP and risk profiles going forward with regards to proper evaluation of our green wealth. Your thoughts?
Yeah, thank you. What is clear is that we now recognize the shortcomings of traditional GDP as we know it, and greening GDP will obviously and of economies for countries that are these economies, these resources. We must be very clear, by the way, I need to be clear on this. It does not necessarily mean that GDP for all the countries or any country would expand naturally, but what we need to know is that
could you keep your microphone still? There's a lot of distortion. Just keep it still, please, and speak directly into it. Okay. But keep it still. Okay. Thank you.
What I was saying was that there are positive and negative externalities, and it's the net value, as we are demonstrating in the presentation with carbon sequestration, that will matter for GDP rebasing. So some countries will have their GDP increase depending on the size, the net effect of those externalities. Others would have their GDP increase. For countries whose GDP would increase, they have the opportunity to raise their risk profile. In other words, to improve their risk assessment, which in turn can allow them to access capital markets, as Dr. Moss was talking about. And we have evidence already, as demonstrated in the paper, that countries that have net value of natural capital embedded in their GDP have lower borrowing costs, and that is important because it helps them to mobilize additional resources that will raise their headroom that can then now be invested in other assets that will allow them to increase their GDP further and continue to improve the well-being of their countries. That's the most important thing, and that's the key message that I draw from this work that we have done. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, and a very important one to note. I'm going to come to Dr. Hanan Mosri for your take. What do you see moving forward? What are the critical considerations that we need to make?
I think we really need to all work together to make this happen. So I think there is the the data and data infrastructure that we need to work on, and I think we've done a lot of work before with African development on related issues, African Development Bank, so we can continue to work as UNECA and African Development Bank and other partners to push that agenda in terms of what do we need to do to capture that at the data level. But then we need to equally work on the other part of how do we create the resources from it, whether advancing all the work that we've started in carbon credit markets and building regional value chains, on doing advancing the regional policy reforms that are needed to enable that, and it's gonna take all of us to really commit and invest in it. But the benefits for the citizens and for countries would be huge. So from our side, we continue to, we commit to actually advancing that agenda, and we look forward to seeing really reaping the benefits of all that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Morsi. And I'm going to come to Dr. Wera next. During your term as minister, Rwanda has actually taken very concrete steps to value its own green wealth, its natural capital. Based on your experience in Rwanda, what do you think the prospects are for Africa in general, just based on some of the things that you've had to go through?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think there are lessons that other countries should learn from existing experience, starting by Rwanda. And I really agree with Professor Guna when he says the capacity building matters a lot when it comes to upgraded work under natural capital accounting. We've realized that having those accounts is really an entry point to even unlock the climate finance. But you can do some basic analysis. You can inform the GDP at a certain level. But if you want to upgrade this work, capacity building matters a lot. And what's also important is institutionalization of this natural capital accounting work. It's not only an exercise to be done by the National Institute of Statistics or maybe something that should be owned by the Ministry of Environment, but it's a joint work because some institution maybe will be...
It's an ecosystem.
It's an ecosystem, actually, when it comes to collecting data, analyzing those data, and having the right expertise. And again, what's really the most important thing is just to have the required resources, just to bring this work at a level that really could inform the GDP, because we've also attempted just to come up with an environmentally adjusted macroeconomic indicator. This was a first attempt, but we realized that due to missing data, we could not really come up with the really estimate just to conclude on the total wealth of our nation. So which means that this requires huge data, quality data, expertise, and capacity building matters a lot. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to give thank you very much, Dr. Wera. I'm going to give the last word to Professor Chika Orama. I'm going to give you 1 minute just to close because your presentation itself has been quite robust. So I just want you to reflect again on what you've heard from your colleagues in making your final comment.
Thank you very much, moderator. I would just use this opportunity to thank everyone. This is a call to action coming from the highest levels, from the heads of states, now the institutions in Africa and friends of Africa. Let's come together and do what Hanan Morsi is also requesting. We work together, bring the data, bring the capacity, bring the expertise, and let's make it work for Africa. Africa can lead the world in making this particular methodology and approach work for the rest of the world and for climate transition. And again, unlocking that capital will require beneficiation of our natural wealth, including building the value chains, like Moti has said, but also it requires also measuring the flow of produced services from already being produced, like carbon sequestration and so on. And the final word for me is, together we can do it. And thanks to all the teams that worked around the world, Gunnar, Pushpam, colleagues from the World Bank, my wonderful, wonderful colleagues from the ECVP. At the end, I will plead for just them to come and have a photo up with all the colleagues here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Rama.